The card declined at the postpartum desk. Danielle Thompson was still wearing her hospital wristband when the nurse tried again. Declined. Her husband, Mark Thompson, didn't look at her. He stepped aside, lowered his voice just enough to wound, and made the call. Cancel all her cards. Effective now. People heard it. A nurse paused. A stranger looked away. Danielle said nothing. She simply stood there, holding her newborn, as access vanished in real time. Down the hall, a financial officer glanced at a screen and froze at the name tied to a fraud case already in review. Stay with this story. If you believe power reveals itself through process, not noise, don't look away now. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your voice matters. And if stories of quiet strength and legal justice speak to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Danielle Thompson woke before the monitors did. The room was quiet in the way hospitals were only quiet between scheduled interruptions. No footsteps, no carts, just the low, steady breath of the building itself. Her newborn slept against her chest, warm and impossibly small, rising and falling as if learning the rules of gravity for the first time. Danielle, it did not move. She lay there replaying the moment at the billing desk, not with anger, not even with disbelief, but with the same internal discipline she had learned years ago when numbers didn't add up, and emotions only clouded judgment. Declined. Declined again. Then Mark's voice controlled efficient final. Cancel all her cards. Effective now. He had said it the way people signed off on emails, as if cutting her off were administrative housekeeping, not an act of violence carried out in public. The nurse had apologized to Danielle, quietly, reflexively, as if the fault belonged anywhere else. Danielle had nodded once, adjusted her hold on the baby, and stepped aside. She had not asked Mark why. She had not reminded him that she had just given birth. She had not defended herself to the strangers who pretended not to hear. Because Danielle had learned long before marriage that the most revealing data came after the interruption, after the sudden removal of access. That was when patterns showed themselves. Mark returned to the room 10 minutes later, carrying a paper cup of coffee and the practiced expression of a man who believed the matter was settled. They'll sort it out later, he said, setting the cup down. Billing systems glitch all the time. Danielle watched the coffee cool. It wasn't a glitch, she said finally. Mark sighed, not loudly, not angrily, just enough to signal inconvenience. Danielle, he said, you don't need to worry about money right now. You need rest. You've been through a lot. She turned her head toward him, looked at his face, at the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers. I didn't worry, she said. I noticed. That irritated him more than an argument would have. The drive home 2 days later passed in silence. Danielle sat in the back seat, the baby secured beside her, while Mark drove with one hand on the wheel and the other scrolling through his phone at red lights. Messages came in constantly. He smiled at some, frowned at others. Danielle memorized none of them. She memorized his posture instead. The slight forward lean, the tension in his jaw, the way his leg bounced when traffic slowed. Stress, she noted. Not panic, not yet. The apartment door opened to a space that looked unchanged and yet felt different, like a room that had already been vacated emotionally. Danielle placed the baby down gently and went to the kitchen. The fridge was stocked. The counters were clean. Normality carefully maintained. She reached for her phone and opened the banking app. Locked. Not just the credit cards. The checking account. The savings account. Even the small joint account they had once agreed was for emergencies. She didn't try again. She set the phone down and walked to the bedroom. Mark followed her this time. I took care of it, he said, anticipating the question she didn't ask. Temporarily. Until things stabilize. Define stabilize, Danielle said. You've been emotional, he replied too quickly. Anyone would be. And I can't have irregular activity flagged right now. Flagged. That word lodged itself neatly into place. Irregular, how she asked. Mark waved a hand. Purchases, timing. It doesn't matter. Danielle sat on the edge of the bed. I haven't made a single purchase since the delivery room, she said. That's not the point. It is if you're using it as justification. He straightened. I'm trying to protect us. Danielle looked at him, really looked this time, and understood something with sudden clarity. He believed what he was saying, not because it was true, but because belief made control easier to live with. That night, while Mark slept, Danielle opened the drawer beside the bed and took out a small notebook she had carried for years. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't a diary. It was a log. She wrote, date time action. Financial access revoked, location hospital billing desk, witnesses nurse first name on badge security officer near elevators, multiple patients. Verbal statement, cancel all her cards. Effective now. She closed the notebook and slid it back into the drawer. In the days that followed, Mark's behavior shifted in subtle ways. He began forwarding emails to her that framed their situation as concern. Articles about postpartum adjustment. Messages from his mother asking if Danielle was doing okay. He offered to handle groceries, offered to pay bills himself, offered solutions that all shared one common feature: Danielle's continued dependence. She accepted nothing. Instead, she began collecting paper. Receipts from the hospital mailed weeks later, insurance statements, utility notices that showed account numbers Mark had assumed she wouldn't recognize. She photographed everything, not for leverage, for sequence. One afternoon, while the baby slept, Danielle opened her laptop and accessed a system she had not touched in months. Her credentials still worked. She navigated calmly, bypassing internal dashboards she no longer needed, until she found the alert. A fraud review, active, mid-tier priority. Processor, Silverline National Bank. Merchant ID, a string of numbers that meant nothing to most people. To Danielle, it meant everything. She did not click deeper, not yet. Instead, she closed the laptop and returned to the living room just as Mark walked in. He stopped when he saw her standing there, the baby in her arms, the notebook on the table behind her. Are you writing things down about me now? He asked, attempting humor. I'm keeping track, she said. Of what changes? He laughed a little too loudly. You always liked lists. Yes, she said, because they don't lie. That night, after Mark left the room to take a call, Danielle's phone buzzed. An internal message, not addressed to her directly. An automated copy sent to a legacy email alias she had never deleted. Subject: request for beneficial ownership confirmation institution, Silverline National Bank case. Reference pending fraud review. Danielle read it once. Then she deleted nothing. She stood by the window, holding her child, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Mark believed control was something you asserted. Danielle knew better. Control was something you documented. And somewhere inside, the very system Mark trusted to protect him, a record was already waiting. Mark Thompson had never asked Danielle how she learned to sit so still when things shifted. He had assumed it was temperament, a personality trait, something innate and harmless, like preferring tea over coffee or reading contracts for pleasure. In the early years of their marriage, he had even admired it, called her steady, told friends she was the calm one. He never asked where that calm came from. Danielle's steadiness had been trained. Long before she met Mark, before marriage and mortgages and polite dinners with people who mistook confidence for volume, Danielle had learned how quickly stability could be erased by assumptions. She had learned it in conference rooms where everyone nodded until one number didn't fit. In audit reviews where the room went silent, not because of anger, but because of realization. She had learned that truth rarely announced itself. It waited. Danielle grew up in a household where money was discussed in structures, not amounts. Where dinner conversations included words like fiduciary exposure and beneficial interest, spoken casually without drama. Her father had believed secrecy was vulgar. Her mother believed silence was protection. Between them, Danielle learned to listen. When she entered banking, she chose compliance not because it was powerful, but because it was invisible. Compliance sat at the edges of every transaction. It did not move money. It watched money move and asked why. By the time she met Mark, Danielle had already stepped back from public-facing roles. She had shifted into advisory positions, consulted quietly, and eventually folded her stake into the Thompson Family Trust, a structure so deliberately uninteresting that few people ever bothered to look inside. Mark certainly hadn't. He knew she worked in finance. He knew she used to be important somewhere. He had filled in the rest with his own assumptions. That suited Danielle just fine. Now, standing in the kitchen while Mark spoke into his phone in the other room, she watched the past intersect with the present in a way she had not anticipated, but immediately understood. "No, that's already cleared," Mark said, his voice carrying through the thin wall. "The processor approved it months ago. There's nothing to reopen." Danielle didn't flinch. Processor, approved, reopen. The words aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. She adjusted the baby against her shoulder and listened without appearing to listen. Mark paced as he spoke, the rhythm of his steps, betraying agitation he believed he was hiding. "I told you," he continued, "everything runs through Silverline. They're conservative. If they signed off, it's done." Danielle closed her eyes for half a second. Silverline National Bank had always been conservative. That was precisely why they caught things others missed. Mark ended the call and stepped into the kitchen, stopping short when he realized she was standing there. "How long have you been there?" he asked. "Long enough," Danielle said. He forced a smile. "You should rest." "I am," she replied. He studied her, searching for something: accusation, suspicion, hysteria. He found none of it. That unsettled him. Later that evening, after Mark left for what he described as a quick meeting, Danielle opened her laptop again. This time, she did not hesitate. She accessed the risk portal using credentials that had long ago stopped being updated, but had never been revoked. Institutions were slow that way. They assumed people forgot. Danielle never forgot. She navigated directly to the case reference from the email. The screen populated with transaction summaries, timestamps, and merchant profiles. She scanned the top layer first, letting her eyes move the way they always had, fast, but not careless. There it was. A pattern, not obvious enough to trigger an automatic shutdown, not sloppy enough to suggest desperation, but consistent in the way that only someone confident in immunity would be consistent, recurring invoices just below secondary review thresholds. Vendors registered to mailing addresses that shared a zip code but not a building. Payment timing clustered around reporting cutoffs. And at the center of it, threaded through multiple entities, like a signature written in negative space, was Mark. Not his name, his behavior. Danielle leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. She did not feel betrayed. That surprised her. What she felt was recognition. This was who Mark had always been, someone who believed systems existed to be navigated, not respected. Someone who mistook familiarity with process for ownership of it. She clicked into the merchant onboarding documents. The handwriting on one signature caught her eye. She enlarged it, compared it. Then she closed the file. Proof was not something you rushed. The front door opened a few minutes later. Mark returned, loosening his tie as he walked in, performing exhaustion like a shield. "Long night," he said. Danielle nodded. "I heard." He froze for a fraction of a second. "Heard what you on the phone." "About the processor." Mark recovered quickly. "Work stuff. Is that what you call it?" she asked. He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Danielle did not answer. She walked past him, carrying the baby toward the bedroom, leaving Mark standing alone in the kitchen with a question he had not expected to be asked. That night, after Mark fell asleep, Danielle added another entry to her notebook. Date time overheard statement. Everything runs through Silverline. They already cleared it. Emotional state observed. Defensive confidence, notable inconsistency. Assumes finality where none exists. She closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. The next morning, Danielle received a message from someone she had not spoken to in years, Rachel Moore. Rachel had been a junior associate when Danielle first consulted for her firm. Sharp, methodical, allergic to shortcuts. They had lost touch not because of conflict, but because both had learned the value of distance. The message was brief. Heard your name came up in a Silverline review. If you want eyes on it, I'm around. Danielle stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she typed, "Not yet. But thank you for noticing," Rachel responded almost immediately. "I always do." Danielle closed the message and turned her attention back to the baby, who was awake now, eyes unfocused but searching. She thought of the billing desk, the declined cards, the way Mark had spoken as if removing access were a correction, not an exposure. He believed power lived in permissions. Danielle knew better. Power lived in records. And somewhere deep inside Silverline's systems, a file with Mark's work stitched through it was still open. Still accumulating data, still waiting for the moment when silence became too loud to ignore. Danielle did not rush that moment. She had learned long ago that the most decisive outcomes arrived not with confrontation, but with confirmation. Mark Thompson liked numbers because they behaved when he told them to. At least, that was how it felt to him. Numbers appeared orderly, obedient columns that could be nudged, rounded, deferred. He had learned early in his career that no one questioned figures presented with confidence and timing. If you spoke in summaries instead of specifics, people assumed the work had already been done. That assumption had carried him far. He framed his work as consulting strategic procurement vendor optimization efficiency reviews. The language was vague enough to discourage scrutiny and impressive enough to invite trust. Clients liked him. Partners vouched for him. Banks processed his transactions without pause. Until they didn't, Danielle saw the first sign of strain, not in a statement, but in Mark's behavior. He began taking calls in the hallway instead of the living room. Lowered his voice when certain names appeared on his screen. He stopped leaving his laptop open when he stepped away, a habit he had never bothered to correct before. Stress, she noted again. Still not panic. One afternoon, while Mark showered, Danielle's phone vibrated with a system notification she hadn't expected. Not an alert, not a warning. A quiet internal update. Case status modified mid-tier review elevated to committee consideration. Danielle read it twice. Silverline did not escalate lightly. She moved through the apartment, performing the rituals of daily life. Folding laundry, warming a bottle, checking the baby monitor, while her mind assembled timelines the way it always had. Calmly, precisely. Mark had believed the processor cleared everything months ago. That meant one of two things. Either he had misunderstood the clearance, or he had relied on someone else's assurance without verifying it himself. Both were mistakes. That evening, Mark arrived home later than usual. His smile was tight, his kiss distracted. "You wouldn't believe the paperwork I'm buried under," he said, dropping his bag by the door. "Everyone wants something documented now." Danielle looked up from the couch. "That's usually how it goes," she said. He paused. "What's that supposed to mean?" She smiled faintly. "Nothing." Mark sat down across from her, rubbing his temples. "I need you to do me a favor," he said. Danielle waited. "I need you to stay out of my work for a bit," he continued. "No calls, no questions, no background checks." There it was. Not fear, control. "I wasn't in your work," Danielle said. "You brought it home," Mark exhaled sharply. "This isn't the time for semantics." "No," she agreed. "It's the time for accuracy." He stood abruptly. "You're reading too much into things." Danielle did not argue. She simply watched him retreat into the bedroom, the door closing harder than necessary. Later that night, after the apartment fell quiet again, Danielle returned to her laptop. She accessed the transaction logs in segments, careful not to leave a footprint that suggested curiosity beyond her scope. She had taught others how to audit without triggering alarms. She applied the same discipline now. The fraud case had grown. More entries, more notes, more internal comments flagged with neutral language that masked concern. Vendor relationship appears structured to avoid secondary review thresholds. Repeated invoice formatting similarities noted across entities. Awaiting confirmation of beneficial ownership for escalation. Danielle leaned back, hands resting still on the keyboard. Mark had built his operation like a maze designed to confuse, not conceal. It relied on fatigue, on the assumption that no one would care enough to trace every turn. Silverline cared. And once a system like that began to care, it did not forget. She cross-referenced dates. Each flagged transaction aligned with a moment Mark had come home late. With calls taken in cars, with weekends suddenly claimed by client emergencies. The pattern was complete. Danielle closed the laptop and returned it to the shelf. The next morning, Mark announced he would be traveling. "Just overnight," he said. "I need to straighten a few things out." With Silverline, Danielle asked lightly. His hand froze on the coffee mug. "How do you know that name?" he demanded. Danielle met his gaze evenly. "You say it in your sleep." That unsettled him more than anger would have. He left without another word. As soon as the door closed, Danielle picked up her phone and made a call she had been delaying. "Rachel," she said when the line connected. "I was wondering when you'd call," Rachel replied. "I need you to explain something to me," Danielle said. "Not as a lawyer, as someone who understands process." Rachel didn't hesitate. "Okay. If a mid-tier fraud review moves to committee." Danielle continued, "What's the one thing the subject always underestimates?" Rachel was silent for a moment. "The assumption that silence means safety," she said. "People think if no one's calling them, they're fine." Danielle nodded. "That's what I thought." And Rachel added carefully, "If your name is anywhere near that case, it won't stay quiet." "I know," Danielle said. "That's why I haven't touched it directly." Rachel exhaled. "You're still you." "Yes," Danielle said. "I am." They ended the call without further explanation. That afternoon, Danielle received a forwarded email from Mark. He didn't comment on it, didn't add context, just sent it. The subject line read, "Request for clarification processor documentation." Danielle opened it slowly. The message was brief, polite, procedural. "We require additional documentation regarding vendor relationships referenced in prior submissions. Please respond within 5 business days." 5 days. Mark had believed he was ahead of the system. He was not. That night, Danielle updated her notebook again. Date time event escalation notice. Forwarded by Mark observation, attempt to normalize formal inquiry, risk assessment moderate increasing. She closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer next to the one item she had not yet opened. A sealed envelope, addressed to her, Mark's handwriting. She did not break the seal. Some things were better left untouched until the right moment. Danielle returned to the living room and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the city outside. Mark believed fraud was a transaction problem. Danielle knew it was a patience problem. And Silverline, with its conservative systems and unglamorous diligence, was about to demonstrate exactly how patient it could be. The apartment felt smaller once Mark left for his overnight trip. Not emptier, just tighter, as if the walls had quietly shifted inward after the door closed behind him. Danielle noticed it most in the mornings, when the light entered the living room at an angle that made everything look briefly unfamiliar. The couch, the table, the framed photo from their wedding still smiling with a confidence that now felt misplaced. She did not take the photo down. She had learned not to erase evidence of belief. It mattered later to remember what people had once thought they were building. Danielle moved through the days with careful efficiency, feeding, sleeping, logging. Her body was still healing, but she refused the narrative Mark had begun, offering others that she was fragile, erratic, overwhelmed. She was tired. That was not the same thing. The mail arrived in the early afternoon. Danielle retrieved it herself, even though Mark had once insisted on handling anything financial. The stack was thin. A utility notice. A hospital statement. A letter from the insurance provider folded twice instead of once. She opened that one first. The numbers were familiar. The formatting was not. Danielle sat at the kitchen table and smoothed the paper flat, comparing it to the digital copy she had already photographed days earlier. Same charges, same dates, different routing line. Someone had attempted to move responsibility. She marked the discrepancy in her notebook. Billing statement altered format, routing adjustment inconsistent with prior submissions. Possible attempt to reclassify payer that night. Mark called. He didn't video chat. He never did when he felt uncertain. "How are things there?" he asked. "Stable," Danielle replied. "And the baby sleeping?" He hesitated. "Listen, I might need you to sign something when I get back. Just a form, to smooth things over." Danielle pictured the sealed envelope still sitting untouched in the drawer. "What kind of form?" she asked. "Just an acknowledgement," Mark said quickly. "Standard stuff. Standard for who?" she asked. "For us," he replied. She let the silence stretch. "I don't sign what I haven't read," she said finally. Mark exhaled sharply. "Why are you making everything difficult?" Danielle closed her eyes. "I'm not," she said. "I'm making it accurate." The call ended shortly after. 2 days later, Danielle's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't internal. It was Rachel. "They've requested preliminary documentation from your husband," Rachel said carefully. "Not by name, by entity." Danielle didn't ask how Rachel knew. "What kind of documentation?" "Vendor contracts. Proof of service delivery? Independent verification?" Danielle nodded. "That's where it will stall." "Yes," Rachel agreed. "Because it always does." That evening, Danielle reviewed the receipts she had been collecting. They were ordinary on their own. Grocery purchases, pharmacy charges, small transactions that Mark had dismissed as irrelevant. But placed in sequence before the card cancellation after the hospital stay, they told a different story. They showed timing, and timing was everything. Mark returned late that night, looking tired but composed. He kissed the baby, asked Danielle how she was feeling, then went straight to the bedroom. He emerged a few minutes later, holding the envelope. "I need you to sign this," he said, placing it on the table between them. Danielle did not reach for it. "What is it?" she asked. "An agreement," Mark replied. "Just temporary. To clarify financial responsibilities while you recover." Danielle also opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a document labeled Spousal Financial Authorization. Her name appeared 3 times. Her signature line once. The language was dense but not subtle. It would grant Mark full discretionary control over shared and individual accounts in the interest of household stability. Danielle read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it back into the envelope. "No," she said. Mark's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand exactly," Danielle replied. "That's why the answer is no." He slammed his hand on the table. "I'm trying to protect you." Danielle did not raise her voice. "You're trying to protect yourself," she said, "from documentation." The word landed heavily between them. Mark stared at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time, and not liking what he saw. "You've been snooping," he accused. "No," Danielle said. "I've been noticing. That night after Mark fell asleep, Danielle packed a small bag. Not to leave, just to be ready. She placed copies of key documents inside. Photographs, statements, the notebook, and the envelope. The next morning, Danielle took the baby for a walk. The city moved around her as if nothing had changed. People went to work. Coffee shops opened. A busker played the same song he always played on the corner. Danielle sat on a bench and checked her phone. An email had arrived from Silverline. Not addressed to her, but visible to her. Formal review scheduled. Date, time, location. Danielle closed her eyes and breathed in slowly. Mark believed cutting her off would make her powerless. What it had done instead was remove noise. And in the absence of noise, systems spoke clearly. She adjusted the baby's blanket and began walking home. There was still time, but not much. Danielle waited until the apartment was quiet again before opening her laptop. Not because she feared interruption. Mark had already made it clear that he preferred not to see what she was doing, but because silence helped her think in layers. Noise flattened information. Silence let it separate. She placed the notebook to her left. The laptop centered her phone face down to the right. Then she began. She did not start with Mark's name. That was the mistake most people made when they believed a person was the problem. Danielle had learned that fraud rarely began with a name. It began with behavior, then structure, then repetition. Names came last once the pattern was undeniable. She accessed the records through channels that were boring by design. Monthly merchant summaries, processor settlement logs, compliance notes written in neutral language that said nothing while implying everything. Danielle read them the way she always had, slowly, without urgency, allowing the system to speak in its own syntax. The first thing she noticed was restraint. Silverline's analysts had not overreacted. They had not accused. They had not escalated prematurely. Instead, they had annotated, highlighted, cross-referenced. That told Danielle two things. First, whoever was handling the review knew what they were doing. Second, they were waiting for confirmation. She pulled up the merchant profile tied to the case. It was registered under a consulting entity with a generic name, clean, forgettable, deliberately unsearchable. The address led to a commercial mailbox service. The phone number redirected to a virtual line that forwarded calls during business hours only. Professional, careful, but not original. Danielle opened the onboarding documents. The signature appeared again. She enlarged it, rotated it slightly, and compared it against a scanned copy of Mark's signature from their mortgage file stored in a separate folder on her computer. The difference was subtle. Too subtle for a casual reviewer. Not subtle enough for someone trained to notice pressure points and stroke sequencing. Forgery was not always about imitation. Sometimes it was about assumption, assuming no one would look closely. Danielle did not mark it as forged. She marked it as inconsistent. That distinction mattered. She moved on. Transaction timing revealed the second pattern. Invoices clustered just beneath secondary review thresholds. Payments released at intervals that avoided weekend processing delays. Refunds issued in amounts that appeared random until mapped. Danielle opened a spreadsheet and began plotting dates. It took 20 minutes for the pattern to emerge. When it did, she closed the file without satisfaction. This was not clever. This was lazy confidence. Mark had built his system on the belief that compliance fatigue was inevitable, that analysts would glance, sigh, and move on. Silverline had not moved on. Danielle leaned back in her chair, the baby monitor glowing quietly on the counter behind her. She thought of the envelope Mark had pushed toward her, the authorization he had wanted her to sign. Not desperation, preemption. He knew something was coming. He just believed he could get ahead of it. Her phone vibrated. Another internal message. This one tagged Risk Operations. Preliminary document request incomplete. Awaiting clarification from merchant representative. Danielle did not respond. Instead, she opened a new document and began listing what had already been requested. Vendor contracts, proof of service delivery, independent verification of client engagements, beneficial ownership confirmation. The last item appeared twice. That was no accident. Danielle closed the document and stood stretching carefully. Her body still protested certain movements. Healing took time. So did exposure. The next day, Mark attempted a different approach. He brought home groceries, cooked dinner, asked Danielle if she needed anything. The performance was careful, almost tender. "You know, I'm just trying to keep things together," he said, passing her a plate. "I know," Danielle replied. He smiled, relieved. "Good." Later, when she was settling the baby, Mark hovered in the doorway. "I spoke to someone at the bank today," he said casually. Danielle didn't look up. "Did you?" "Yes. They said the review is routine, nothing to worry about." Danielle finished fastening the onesie and turned to face him. "Who did you speak to?" she asked. Mark hesitated. "Someone in processing. A name." He frowned. "Why does that matter?" Danielle held his gaze. "Because processors don't give assurances," she said. "They document." Mark's smile faltered. "You're reading too much into this," he said. Danielle said nothing. That night after Mark went to bed, Danielle made one phone call. Rachel answered on the first ring. "They're asking for beneficial ownership confirmation twice," Danielle said. Rachel exhaled. "Then they're already past suspicion." "What happens next?" Danielle asked. Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Either the subject cooperates, or the system stops asking." Danielle closed her eyes. "And when it stops asking, it starts preserving," Rachel said. "Everything." Danielle ended the call and returned to her notebook. Date, time, observation. Subject, attempting reassurance without authority. Risk assessment, escalation, imminent. Recommendation, continue documentation. No intervention. The following morning, Danielle received an automated calendar invitation. Silverline National Bank formal review meeting attendance required. She did not forward it. She did not print it. She simply added it to her calendar and closed the app. Mark noticed the shift before he could name it. He became more attentive, more anxious. He asked questions that circled without landing. Danielle answered only what was asked. No more, no less. When the day of the review approached, Mark suggested they take a trip. "Get out of town," he said. "Clear our heads." Danielle shook her head. "I have an appointment." "With who?" he asked. She met his eyes. "A system," she said. Mark laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're not serious." Danielle picked up her notebook and slid it into her bag. "I'm always serious," she said. On the morning of the review, Danielle dressed simply. Neutral colors. Nothing that announced authority. She fed the baby, kissed Mark on the cheek, and left without drama. Mark watched her go with the uneasy expression of a man who sensed a shift but could not yet see its direction. Danielle entered the Silverline building through a side entrance. Glass walls, clean lines, quiet efficiency. The receptionist smiled politely and asked her name. "Danielle Thompson," she said. The smile paused just long enough. Then the receptionist stood. "They're expecting you," she said. Danielle followed her down the hallway. Her steps measured, her posture relaxed. Mark believed power was loud. Danielle knew better. Power lived in records, and the records were ready. The conference room at Silverline National Bank was designed to discourage emotion. Glass walls let light in, but kept sound contained. The table was polished to the point of reflection, forcing anyone seated there to see themselves whether they wanted to or not. No artwork, no plants, just screens, chairs, and a quiet hum from the ventilation system that made prolonged silence feel intentional. Danielle arrived 5 minutes early. She chose a seat near the end of the table, not at the head, not closest to the screen. The position of a participant, not a presider. She placed her bag at her feet, her notebook inside it, unopened. 2 people were already in the room. A man in his early 40s with a neutral expression and a tablet resting on the table in front of him. He wore no tie. His badge read, "Evan Brooks Risk Operations." Across from him sat a woman, slightly older, hair pulled back neatly, fingers folded with deliberate stillness. Lydia Chen, legal counsel. They both looked up when Danielle entered. "Miss Thompson," Evan said, standing. "Thank you for coming." Danielle shook his hand. "Thank you for scheduling." Lydia nodded politely. "Please have a seat. We'll begin shortly." Danielle sat. She did not scan the room. She did not look at the screens. She waited. Moments later, the door opened again. Mark Thompson entered with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged in professional spaces by default. He wore a tailored jacket, his posture straight, his smile practiced. "Sorry I'm late," he said, glancing briefly at Danielle before turning his attention to Evan. "Traffic." Danielle did not acknowledge him. Mark took the seat opposite her, placing his phone face down on the table, as if that gesture alone signaled cooperation. Evan cleared his throat. "This is a formal review meeting regarding a series of transactions processed through Silverline National Bank," he said evenly. "The purpose today is clarification." Mark nodded. "Of course. Happy to help." Lydia slid a folder toward him. "We'll be asking questions in sequence. Please answer directly." Mark smiled again, naturally. Danielle watched his hands. They rested flat on the table, fingers splayed slightly as if claiming space. He had always done that when he wanted to appear unthreatened. Evan tapped his tablet. The screen at the end of the room lit up, displaying a timeline. "We'll begin with vendor relationships," he said. "Specifically, the entities associated with your consulting engagements over the past 18 months. Mark leaned forward. "I've worked with multiple vendors, all legitimate." Evan nodded. "We're sure some are. We're interested in these." A list appeared. Company names, dates, amounts. Mark glanced at it, his eyes moving quickly. "Yes, those are standard subcontractors." "Can you explain the services rendered by this entity?" Lydia asked, pointing to one. Mark didn't hesitate. "Strategic sourcing, market analysis, and this one," she continued, "logistics coordination." Danielle noted the repetition. Vague categories, no specifics. Evan swiped again. "We requested documentation to support these engagements." "I sent what I had," Mark replied. "You sent summaries," Evan said calmly. "We requested originals." Mark's jaw tightened. "My vendors don't always provide." Lydia raised a hand gently. "Mr. Thompson, please answer the question. Do original contracts exist?" Mark hesitated. "Just long enough." "They should," he said. "I'll need to follow up." Danielle looked at the screen. The dates aligned exactly with what she had already logged. Evan turned to the next slide. "Let's talk about timing," he said. These invoices were submitted consistently within narrow windows, just under secondary review thresholds. "Can you explain that?" Mark chuckled lightly. "Coincidence? Billing cycles vary." "Across multiple vendors?" Evan asked. Mark shrugged. "It happens." Silence settled into the room. Not accusatory, just patient. Danielle felt it shift, then the subtle recalibration that occurred when a system recognized resistance. Lydia folded her hands. "Mr. Thompson, are you familiar with the concept of beneficial ownership?" Mark nodded quickly. "Of course. Then you understand why we've requested confirmation," she said. "Yes," he replied. "And I'll provide it." When Evan asked. "Soon." Danielle inhaled slowly. Evan glanced at Lydia, then back at Mark. "There's one more matter," he said. "Several signatures on your vendor onboarding documents appear inconsistent." Mark's head snapped up. "What do you mean inconsistent, not invalid?" Lydia clarified. "Inconsistent." Mark laughed, but it sounded brittle. "Are you suggesting forgery or suggesting review?" Lydia said. Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "This feels excessive." Danielle spoke for the first time. "Excessive is a conclusion," she said quietly. "This is observation." Every head in the room turned toward her. Mark stared. "Why are you talking?" Danielle met his gaze. "Because I'm here." Evan looked between them. "Miss Thompson, are you representing Mr. Thompson today?" "No," Danielle said. "I'm attending." As what Mark demanded. Danielle did not answer him. She turned to Evan instead. "You asked about timing," she said. "There's a reason those invoices cluster." Evan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "We're listening." Danielle stood slowly, carefully. She walked to the screen, not asking permission, not asserting authority, just moving with purpose. She pointed to the timeline. "These submissions avoid weekend settlement delays," she said. "They're timed to clear before secondary review triggers." "That's not coincidence. It's design." Mark stood abruptly. "You don't know what you're talking about." Danielle turned to face him. "I helped design secondary review thresholds," she said calmly. "Years ago." Silence dropped heavily now. Lydia leaned forward. "Miss Thompson, can you clarify your role in this matter?" Danielle nodded. "Yes." She reached into her bag and removed a single document. Not a stack, not a binder, one page. She placed it on the table and slid it toward Lydia. "Before we proceed further," Danielle said, "you'll want to confirm something." Lydia read the document once. Then again. Her expression did not change, but the air in the room did. She passed it to Evan. Evan's fingers paused on the edge of the paper. He read. Then he looked up at Danielle. "Miss Thompson," he said carefully, "can you confirm that you are the beneficial owner listed here?" Danielle nodded once. Yes. Mark's face drained of color. That's not, he began. Lydia raised a hand. Mr. Thompson, please remain seated. Danielle returned to her chair. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply sat, hands folded, as the system recalibrated around a truth it had been circling all along. Evan cleared his throat again. Given this information, he said, we will need to adjust the structure of this review. Lydia nodded. Immediately. Mark looked from face to face, his confidence finally cracking into something else. You knew, he said to Danielle, his voice low. You knew, and you let this happen. Danielle met his eyes. No, she said. I let it reveal itself. The room fell quiet again. This time the silence was no longer neutral. It was decisive. Mark did not speak on the drive home. The silence in the car was heavier than anything that had filled the conference room at Silverline. Their silence had been procedural, measured, deliberate, controlled. Here it was something else. Unmanaged. Uncontained. Danielle sat in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap, watching the city pass through the windshield. She did not look at Mark. She did not need to. She could feel the pressure radiating off him, the unspent words pressing against his jaw. At a red light, he finally broke. You ambushed me, he said. Danielle did not respond. I didn't even know why you were there, he continued. You let me walk in blind. She turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. You walked in the way you always do, she said, assuming the room would bend. Mark scoffed. That was my business. You had no right to interfere. I didn't interfere, Danielle replied. I attended. That's a technicality. No, she said. It's a boundary. The light changed. Mark accelerated harder than necessary. When they reached the apartment, Mark went straight to the bedroom and shut the door. Danielle moved more slowly, setting her bag down, checking on the baby, returning the apartment to order the way she always did, after disruption. She had learned that calm was not the absence of tension. It was the decision not to amplify it. That evening, Mark did not come out for dinner. Danielle ate alone, the baby asleep nearby the table lit by a single lamp. She reviewed nothing. She opened no files. The day had provided enough information. Later, as she was washing dishes, her phone buzzed. A message from Silverline. Formal review expanded. Additional documentation to be preserved. Please refrain from independent contact with involved parties. Danielle read it once and set the phone down. They were preserving now. That was the shift Rachel had warned her about. Preservation meant no more assumptions, no more benefit of the doubt. Everything from this point forward would be logged frozen and interpreted through procedure. Mark came out of the bedroom just before midnight. You could have warned me, he said. Danielle dried her hands and turned to face him. Warned you about what she asked, that you were. He stopped himself, that you were involved. I was always involved, Danielle said. You just didn't think it mattered. Or, Mark laughed without humor. You enjoyed this? Watching me squirm, Danielle shook her head. No, I endured it. There's a difference. He stared at her, searching for something to push against. You're trying to punish me, he said. Danielle's voice remained even. I didn't create the records. That ended the conversation. Over the next week, Mark's behavior shifted again, but this time, the control cracked. He began oscillating between charm and accusation. Apologies followed by blame. Offers to reset things, followed by threats about lawyers and custody. Danielle responded to none of it. She answered logistical questions. She acknowledged messages about the baby. She did not engage in narrative. One afternoon, Mark invited his parents over without telling her. They arrived with concerned faces and rehearsed sympathy. Mark says, you've been under a lot of stress, his mother said gently, sitting across from Danielle. We just want to help. Danielle nodded. I appreciate that. His father cleared his throat. Sometimes after childbirth, emotions can make things feel bigger than they are. Mark watched closely, waiting for her to react. Danielle did not. What feels big to you? She asked calmly. Mark's mother hesitated. Well, the finances, the tension. Danielle folded her hands. Those aren't feelings. Those are conditions. Mark cut in sharply. She's been digging into my work. I've been documenting what intersects my life, Danielle said. Those aren't the same thing. His father frowned. Is there some kind of misunderstanding with the bank? Danielle looked at Mark. That would be for Mark to explain, she said. Mark flushed. It's being handled. Danielle did not contradict him. She did not need to. The visit ended awkwardly with no resolution and no comfort. After they left, Mark turned on her. You made me look unstable, he said. Danielle met his eyes. You spoke. I didn't stop you. That night, she added another entry to her notebook. Event family intervention initiated by subject strategy. Observed. Emotional reframing outcome. No resolution, increased volatility. The following morning, Danielle received another message from Rachel. They're requesting expanded access logs, including internal communications. Danielle replied with a single word. Expected. Mark, meanwhile, began to unravel publicly. He posted vague messages online about betrayal and resilience. He hinted at being targeted, at being misunderstood. Danielle did not respond. She focused on preparing for what came next. Silverline scheduled a second meeting, this time labeled Risk Committee Review. Attendance mandatory. Mark saw the notification over her shoulder. What is that? He demanded. A meeting, Danielle said. You can't keep dragging me into these rooms, he snapped. I'm not dragging you, she replied. You're already there. On the day of the meeting, Mark dressed carefully. Too carefully. He chose a suit he reserved for court appearances and investor pitches. Danielle wore the same neutral tones as before. At Silverline, the room was larger this time. More seats, more screens, more distance. The committee members joined one by one, faces serious. No introductions wasted on pleasantries. The chair spoke first. This is not a continuation, she said. This is a determination. Mark shifted in his seat. Danielle sat still. Evidence appeared on the screen, summarized, not dramatized. Transaction histories, vendor relationships, signature comparisons, internal notes showing how long the system had been watching. No one raised their voice, no one accused. They didn't need to. At one point, Mark tried to interrupt. This is circumstantial, he said. You're connecting dots that... The chair raised a hand. Mr. Thompson, she said, circumstantial evidence becomes structural when it repeats. Mark looked at Danielle, then not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief. You could have stopped this, he said quietly. Danielle didn't answer immediately. Then she said, I did. He frowned. When I didn't sign, she said. When I didn't lie. When I didn't interfere. The committee chair cleared her throat. We will be referring this matter to external authorities, she said, effective immediately. Mark's shoulders slumped. Danielle felt no relief, only finality. After the meeting, Mark tried one last time. You're going to ruin everything, he said in the hallway. Our family, our life. Danielle turned to him. You did that the moment you needed me to be smaller than the truth, she said. She walked away before he could respond. Outside, the air was crisp, clean. Danielle stood for a moment, breathing, grounding herself in the present. She thought of the baby at home, of sleep schedules, of ordinary decisions waiting to be made. This was not victory. This was alignment. The system had done what systems were meant to do when allowed to function without interference. And Danielle, who had been silent for so long, had not needed to raise her voice at all. The processor was never meant to be visible. That was the first rule Danielle had learned when she entered banking years ago. If people noticed the processor, something had already gone wrong. Processing existed beneath the surface, quiet, repetitive, precise. It did not judge. It did not speculate. It recorded. And it remembered. In the days following the committee meeting, Danielle watched Mark struggle with that reality. He no longer spoke in accusations. He spoke in fragments, questions without endpoints, statements framed as hypotheticals. What if they're wrong? What if this blows over? What if someone misread the data? Danielle answered none of it. She had seen this stage before many times, though never this close. It was the phase where the subject tried to negotiate with inevitability, mistaking uncertainty for opportunity. But processors did not negotiate. They time-stamped. Silverline systems began issuing preservation notices, automatic, unemotional, unyielding. Emails went out to departments Mark didn't even know existed. Data mirrors were created. Access logs frozen. Danielle received each notification, quietly adding them to a folder she labeled simply sequence. Not evidence, not case, just sequence. Because this was not about proving something new. It was about aligning what already existed. One afternoon, while Mark was out meeting with an attorney whose name he refused to share, Danielle received an encrypted message from Silverline's legal operations team. We're mapping internal communications related to the merchant accounts. This includes audio voicemail and video metadata where applicable. Danielle closed her eyes. Mark had always been careless with his voice. He liked to talk, to persuade, to reassure himself by hearing his own certainty reflected back. That was another assumption he had made that sound vanished once it dissipated. Danielle knew better. Many systems captured sound not for content, but for context. Voicemail servers, conference call bridges, security cameras with ambient audio buffers that no one reviewed until they had reason. Silverline had reason now. Danielle remembered a call Mark had taken months earlier, pacing the apartment while she folded laundry nearby. He had laughed, then relaxed, certain of clearance. They don't look that closely, he had said. No one does. She had not responded. She didn't need to. 2 days later, Rachel called. They flagged a call, Rachel said without preamble. Danielle sat down, from where a conference bridge Mark used regularly. The system auto-recorded. No one thought to listen until now. Danielle felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not anticipation. Recognition. What's on it, she asked. Rachel hesitated. Him, explaining timing, explaining thresholds, explaining how to stay invisible. Danielle closed her eyes again. Is it admissible? She asked. Yes, Rachel said. Clean chain, logged automatically. He consented to recording when he joined the line. Danielle exhaled slowly. Mark had believed fraud was about numbers. He had never understood that it was also about language. That night, Mark came home visibly shaken. They're listening to calls now, he said. Danielle looked up from the couch. Calls are records, she said. That's not what they're for, he snapped. They're for whatever the system needs them to be, Danielle replied. He stared at her, something like panic finally breaking through. You set me up, he said. Danielle shook her head. You documented yourself. He sank into a chair, rubbing his face. I trusted you, he muttered. Danielle's voice softened, not with sympathy, but with accuracy. You trusted that I would stay quiet, she said. That's not the same thing. The next escalation came quietly. No police, no dramatic knock. Just an official letter delivered mid-morning while Mark was out. Danielle signed for it. Notice of account action. Silverline was freezing all accounts associated with the flagged entities pending external investigation. No withdrawals, no transfers, no modifications. Mark called an hour later. They froze everything he said, his voice breaking. Everything. Danielle closed her eyes. That's procedure, she said. What am I supposed to do, he asked. Danielle thought carefully before answering. Tell the truth, she said. He laughed bitterly. You think that helps now? It always helps, she replied. It just doesn't always protect. The external authorities moved more slowly. They always did. But they moved with weight. Requests for interviews, subpoenas for documents, formal notices sent through channels that did not allow for interpretation or negotiation. Danielle watched from the perimeter, not intervening, not accelerating, not shielding. She maintained one boundary with precision. Anything related to the bank moved through formal counsel. Anything related to the baby moved through her. Mark tried to blur that boundary more than once. He asked her to explain things to investigators, to clarify intent, to contextualize his behavior. Danielle refused every time. "I won't narrate your actions," she said. "They speak clearly enough." One afternoon, while the baby napped, Danielle reviewed a final piece of documentation Silverline had compiled. It was not dramatic. No highlighted text, no bold accusations, just a timeline. Transactions, communications, approvals, assumptions. And threaded through all of it, a single line, repeated at irregular intervals, cleared by processor. Danielle closed the file. That phrase had protected Mark for years. Now it undid him. Because processors did not clear people, they cleared transactions. And transactions once recorded did not forget who initiated them. Mark stopped sleeping. He paced at night talking to himself, replaying meetings that had already ended. He asked Danielle questions she did not answer. What if they charge me? What if I lose everything? What if I go to jail? Danielle listened without responding. She had learned that fear did not require an audience. It required consequence. The final piece came unexpectedly. A message from Silverline's chair forwarded through counsel. Audio and transaction alignment complete. External referral finalized. Danielle read it once. Then she deleted nothing. She went to the bedroom where Mark sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. "They have everything he said without looking up." Danielle nodded. "They do." "You're not even angry," he said. Danielle considered that. "I was," she said, "when you thought silence made you untouchable." He looked up then, and now, she said, "I'm done." That was the moment Mark finally understood something he had missed all along. This had never been about revenge. It had been about alignment. The system had done what it was designed to do once the noise was removed. Danielle had not needed to punish. She had only needed to stop absorbing the cost of someone else's deception. That night, after Mark fell asleep, exhausted, not absolved, Danielle stood by the window again. The city lights flickered in patterns she recognized. Order, chaos, repetition. She thought of the processor. Quiet, invisible, precise. Just like the strength she had carried all along. The document Mark had never read sat between them like a dormant fault line. It had been there for years, filed away among other papers that marked milestones, marriage, mortgage insurance. He had signed it the way he signed most things, quickly, confidently trusting that anything important would have been pointed out to him. Danielle had pointed it out. He hadn't listened. The morning after the external referral was finalized, Mark woke to a quiet apartment and the sense that something had already moved beyond his reach. Danielle was in the kitchen feeding the baby, her posture relaxed, her movement steady. There was no tension in her body now, no bracing. That unsettled him more than anger ever had. "I spoke to my attorney," he said, hovering in the doorway. Danielle nodded without looking up. "He says intent matters," Mark continued. "That context matters." Danielle finished fastening the bib and turned to him. "Intent matters when there's ambiguity," she said. "Context matters when facts are incomplete." Mark swallowed. "And when they're not, then intent is irrelevant," she replied. "And context is decoration." He paced. "They're treating this like I planned it." Danielle watched him carefully. "You did plan it. That's not, you planned the timing," she said. "You planned the thresholds. You planned who would notice and who wouldn't." Mark stopped pacing. "I never thought you thought enough," Danielle said. "You just didn't think it would matter." He laughed weakly. "You always do this. Reduce things to bullet points." Danielle's expression didn't change. "That's how systems read behavior." He sank into a chair. "You could stop this," he said quietly. "You still could." Danielle considered him for a long moment. "I could interfere," she said. "I won't." "Why?" he demanded. "After everything, because interference is what created this," she replied. "And I won't repeat it." That afternoon, Danielle opened the secure folder she had not touched since the first Silverline meeting. Inside was a single email draft, not accusatory, not emotional, procedural. It had been written months ago, scheduled but not sent. Addressed to the board's administrative channel, routed through counsel, copied to compliance and legal oversight. Subject: Confirmation of beneficial ownership, Thompson Family Trust. It contained exactly what the title promised. No commentary, no narrative. Just confirmation. Danielle had written it as a contingency, the way she wrote everything important. Prepared but not activated until necessary. Mark had never known it existed. She read it again now, not because she needed to revise it, but because she wanted to remember why she had waited. The reason was simple. Once sent, it could not be unsent. And once acknowledged, the room would change. Her phone buzzed. A message from Silverline's counsel. We will need formal confirmation of your role prior to final committee actions. Danielle closed her eyes. The system was asking, not accusing. She glanced toward the living room, where Mark sat staring at nothing. You're going to ruin me, he said softly, as if reading her thoughts. Danielle shook her head. You ruined yourself when you needed secrecy to feel secure. She turned back to her laptop. Her finger hovered over the trackpad. She did not rush. She checked the routing one final time. Confirmed recipients. Verified timestamps. Then she clicked. Send. The email left her outbox without ceremony. No sound. No animation. Just gone. Within minutes, confirmations began arriving. Read receipts. Automated acknowledgments. Calendar updates, shifting to include her name where it had not been before. Danielle closed the laptop and sat back. The room felt lighter. Mark noticed. What did you do? He asked. Danielle met his eyes. I confirmed what was already true. His phone buzzed almost immediately. Then again. Then again. He looked at the screen, his face draining of color. They're adding you, he said, to the committee threads. Danielle nodded. I know. You're the... He stopped struggling for the word. Chair Danielle finished. Yes. The word landed heavily between them. You never told me, he said. You never asked. She replied. Mark stood abruptly. This is insane. You let me believe I let you believe what you needed to, Danielle said, because correcting you wouldn't have changed your behavior. He stared at her, something like awe, mixing with resentment. So this was all some test, he demanded. Danielle shook her head. It was a structure. You failed it repeatedly. The next committee meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Danielle attended remotely, camera on, posture relaxed. Mark was not invited. The agenda was concise. Confirmation of ownership. Review of preserved evidence. External authority coordination. Risk mitigation actions. Danielle spoke only when asked. She did not editorialize. She did not frame Mark's actions emotionally. She spoke in terms of exposure, responsibility, and corrective action. When the chair asked if Danielle wished to recuse herself, she answered without hesitation. No, she said. This is governance, not grievance. The committee agreed. By the end of the meeting, decisions had been made. Accounts remained frozen. External coordination continued. Internal safeguards strengthened. Danielle closed the call and sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the stillness. Mark approached her slowly. You're choosing the bank over your marriage, he said. Danielle looked up. I'm choosing integrity over denial, she said. The marriage ended when you needed me to be silent. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. That evening, Danielle packed a second bag. This time, it was not contingency. It was intention. She placed the baby's things carefully inside. Clothes, documents, the notebook. She left the wedding photo where it was. Some evidence didn't need to move. Mark watched her from the doorway. Where are you going? He asked. Somewhere quiet, Danielle said. Where the truth doesn't have to compete. She paused at the door and turned back. This wasn't revenge, she said. It was correction. Mark said nothing. Danielle stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her. The system would continue without her involvement now. That was the point. She had confirmed the structure. She had aligned the records. and she was done carrying what had never been hers to begin with. The risk committee room looked different on the morning Danielle attended in person, not because the furniture had changed, or the screens, or the seating arrangement. It looked different because the assumptions had. She arrived early again, not out of habit this time, but out of choice. The building was quieter at that hour, the corridors still settling into their weekday rhythm. Danielle liked arriving before the institution fully woke up. It reminded her that systems, no matter how large, were made of people who needed time to orient themselves. She checked in with security, exchanged brief nods with staff who now recognized her without surprise, and walked into the committee room. This time, she took the seat at the head of the table. Not ceremoniously, not with pause, just because it was where her name now belonged. Folders were already laid out, tablets charged. A digital clock on the wall counted down to the scheduled start time. Danielle placed her notebook beside her unopened. The members filtered in one by one. Some she recognized from earlier meetings. Others were new external advisors, regulatory liaisons, individuals brought in specifically because the matter had crossed an internal threshold. No one made small talk. When the door closed, the chair of the committee, an older woman with a voice that carried authority without effort, looked at Danielle. "Thank you for being here," she said. Danielle nodded. "Of course." The chair glanced at the agenda projected on the screen. "This meeting concerns final determinations related to the Thompson consulting entities and associated transactions," she said. "We will review preserved evidence, confirm procedural compliance, and finalize referrals." She paused. "For the record, Mr. Mark Thompson is not present today." No one reacted. Danielle felt no satisfaction in that absence, only symmetry. The meeting began with a summary. No dramatization, no moral framing, just facts delivered in clean sequences. Transactions flagged, patterns confirmed, inconsistencies escalated, communications aligned. When the audio file was referenced, Danielle watched the room closely. Not for shock, for comprehension. The voice recording played briefly, just enough to establish context. Mark's voice, confident, relaxed, explaining how to avoid review thresholds. How no one looks that closely. The recording stopped. The room was silent. The chair cleared her throat. "We won't need to hear more." A regulatory liaison spoke next. "Based on the compiled evidence, the external referral is appropriate and necessary," he said. "The conduct meets the standard for further investigation." Danielle listened, hands folded, posture steady. Another member spoke. "We also need to address internal governance exposure given Ms. Thompson's dual role." All eyes turned to Danielle. She did not shift. "I'm prepared to address that," she said. The chair nodded. "Please." Danielle spoke slowly, carefully. "My involvement has followed established boundaries," she said. "I did not initiate the review. I did not alter its scope. I did not interfere with evidence collection. My actions have been limited to confirming ownership, responding to formal requests, and ensuring procedural integrity." She paused. "I understand the concern. I welcome independent oversight." The committee chair nodded approvingly. "That is noted." There was no challenge, no cross-examination, because Danielle had already answered the question they were circling. This was not about conflict of interest. It was about transparency. The committee moved to the final agenda item: account actions. "All associated accounts will remain frozen pending external findings," the chair said. "We will issue notices to affected parties today." Danielle knew what that meant. Mark would receive another letter, another formal message that could not be argued with. She did not imagine his reaction. She had stopped doing that. The meeting adjourned without ceremony. As members stood and gathered their materials, the chair approached Danielle. "You handled this with restraint," she said quietly. "That's not common." Danielle inclined her head slightly. "Restraint preserves clarity." The chair smiled faintly. "It does." Danielle left the building through the same side entrance she had used weeks earlier. Outside, the air felt different again, Not lighter, not heavier. Just settled. She checked her phone. 3 missed calls from Mark, 1 voicemail. She did not listen to it. Instead, she opened her calendar. A new entry had appeared automatically added by her legal counsel. Temporary protective order. Hearing family court. Danielle closed the calendar and continued walking. She did not feel urgency. Everything was arriving in sequence. At the temporary apartment she had rented, quiet, modest, chosen for its proximity to parks and pediatric clinics. Danielle fed the baby and set him down for a nap. Then she opened her notebook. She turned to a clean page and wrote, "Phase transition internal resolution, complete external process. Initiated. Personal boundary enforcement pending." She closed the notebook. Later that afternoon, Mark appeared unannounced. He stood in the doorway, eyes tired, shoulders slumped. "You didn't tell me there would be a hearing," he said. Danielle looked at him calmly. "I didn't schedule it. They froze my accounts," he said. "I can't access anything." "That's procedure," she replied. "You're taking my child," he said, anger flashing briefly. Danielle's voice remained even. "I'm establishing safety and structure." Mark laughed bitterly. "You're hiding behind systems." Danielle stood and faced him fully. "No," she said. "I'm standing in front of them." He looked at her, then, not as his wife. Not as someone he could manage, but as a person he could no longer control. "You could still fix this," he said quietly. "Talk to them. Tell them I won't narrate your actions," Danielle repeated. "I won't minimize them, and I won't carry them." Mark's shoulders sagged. "This isn't how it was supposed to end," he said. Danielle considered that. "Endings are rarely planned," she said. "They're revealed." He stood there a moment longer, then turned and left without another word. Danielle closed the door behind him and locked it. She did not feel triumph. She felt relief. Not because Mark was gone, but because the weight she had been carrying, absorbing explanations, smoothing over inconsistencies, making herself smaller to accommodate someone else's behavior, was no longer hers. That evening, as the sun set through the apartment window, Danielle held her child and watched the light fade. The system had done what systems did when allowed to function. It had observed, it had recorded, and it had acted. Danielle hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had only needed to stop stepping out of the way. The email arrived at exactly 9:17 a.m. Not because anyone had chosen the time for impact, but because automated systems preferred precision. They sent what they were scheduled to send when conditions were met. Nothing more, nothing less. Danielle was feeding the baby when her phone vibrated softly against the kitchen counter. She didn't look at it immediately. She finished what she was doing, wiped her hands, then picked it up. Subject: external referral confirmation from Silverline National Bank Legal Operations. She opened it without ceremony. The message was brief, clinical. This notice confirms that preserved records, including transactional data, internal communications, and audio documentation, have been formally transferred to external authorities. No further internal action is required at this time. Danielle read it once. Then she set the phone down. Across the city, Mark received the same confirmation, along with something else. Danielle learned this, not because she imagined it, but because Mark called her less than 5 minutes later. "You sent it," he said the moment she answered. "I confirmed it," Danielle replied. "That email today, that was you," he insisted. Danielle did not correct him. It was easier for him to believe in a single decisive act than to accept the accumulation of consequences. "What exactly do you think I sent?" she asked. Mark hesitated. "Everything." Danielle nodded. "Then you understand." His voice rose. "You waited. You waited until they had everything." "I waited until the system was finished asking questions," Danielle said. "That's not the same thing. This could have been handled quietly," he snapped. "Internally." "It was," she replied. "For as long as it could be." Mark fell silent. Danielle could hear his breathing on the line, shallow and uneven. "They're going to use the calls," he said finally. "The recordings." "Yes," Danielle said. "They're part of the record." "I didn't know those were you consented when you joined," she said calmly. The notice plays before the line opens. Mark laughed sharply. No one listens to that. Danielle closed her eyes. Systems do, she said. He lowered his voice, desperation seeping in. You're the chair. You could have stopped the transfer. Danielle opened her eyes. I could have delayed it, she said. I won't stop it. Why? He demanded. Why now? Danielle answered carefully. Because the last question was answered, she said. Ownership, responsibility, scope. Mark exhaled. You're choosing them over me. Danielle shook her head, though he couldn't see it. I'm choosing alignment over distortion, she said. You're just standing on the wrong side of it. The call ended without goodbye. That afternoon, Danielle attended the final internal briefing via secure link. It wasn't a meeting, so much as a confirmation legal counsel outlining what had been transferred, what remained sealed, and what was no longer within the bank's jurisdiction. No one argued. No one asked for clarification. The process was complete. When the call ended, Danielle sat quietly for several minutes, letting the stillness settle. There was no adrenaline, no release, just completion. Later that evening, her attorney called. The protective order will be granted, he said, based on financial coercion and documented instability. Danielle nodded. Thank you. And Danielle, he added, the external investigators will likely request a formal statement from you. I'll provide one, she said. In writing, that's wise. After the call, Danielle opened her notebook for the first time in days. She flipped back through the entries, not reading them closely, just confirming their presence. Dates, times, observations. She stopped at the first page. Action Financial Access, revoked location hospital billing desk, witnesses present. She closed the notebook gently. The circle was complete. 2 days later, Mark tried once more. He sent an email this time, not a call. Danielle, we need to talk. This has gone too far. We can still frame this as a misunderstanding. She read it once, then she archived it. No response was also a response. The investigators contacted her the following week. The request was formal, respectful, and narrow in scope. They did not ask how she felt. They asked what she knew. Danielle provided exactly that. Transaction timelines, documentation paths, ownership structures, the absence of interference. When they asked why she hadn't intervened earlier, she answered simply, because the system was still asking questions, she said. Intervening would have distorted the answers. The investigator nodded. That's consistent with the record, he said. The conversation ended there. In the weeks that followed, Mark's world contracted. His accounts remained frozen. His professional relationships dissolved quietly, one by one. Not because of gossip, but because of caution. People didn't distance themselves from scandal. They distanced themselves from uncertainty. Danielle did not track his decline. She focused instead on building a routine that belonged to her. Morning walks, pediatric appointments, reading in the quiet hours when the baby slept. Board correspondence handled efficiently without drama. Silverline appointed an interim governance review committee to assess internal controls. Danielle welcomed it. Transparency was not a threat. It was maintenance. One evening, as she prepared dinner, her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. They've reviewed the audio alignment. It's airtight. Danielle replied with a single word. Good. Rachel responded moments later. You okay? Danielle paused before answering. Yes, she typed. I am. And she was. Not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was unresolved. The finality had arrived not with spectacle, but with confirmation. Danielle stood by the window that night, holding her child, watching the city lights blink in their quiet patterns. Mark had believed that canceling her cards would reduce her options. What it had done instead was remove her obligation to participate in his narrative. The bank had processed his fraud. The system had documented his voice. The law had taken custody of the facts. Danielle had done nothing extraordinary. She had simply remained present long enough for the truth to finish speaking. Danielle's name appeared on the agenda in a way it never had before. Not as a reference, not as a footnote, not as an asterisk requiring explanation. It appeared alone. Danielle Thompson chair. She noticed it when she opened the secure board packet early that morning, sitting at the small kitchen table of her temporary apartment while the baby slept nearby. The font was the same as every other name on the page. The placement, unremarkable. And yet it marked a shift that no announcement ever could. This time, there would be no surprise when she spoke. The meeting began precisely on schedule. The boardroom was fuller than usual, not with tension, but with attention. External observers occupied the back row. Counsel sat with tablets open screens, already populated with references they hoped not to need. Danielle took her seat without ceremony. The vice chair nodded to her. "We'll begin when you're ready." She waited a moment, not for effect, but to let the room settle. Then she spoke. "This meeting is not about resolution," Danielle said calmly. "That has already occurred. It's about responsibility." No one interrupted. She outlined the facts succinctly, not in the language of accusation, but of governance. The timeline of the fraud review. The internal escalation thresholds. The preservation of records. The transfer to external authorities. She did not name Mark. She did not need to. The record already did that. When she finished, the room remained quiet. One of the external advisors cleared his throat. "Ms. Thompson, given your personal connection to the subject, how do you respond to concerns about impartiality?" Danielle did not bristle. She had anticipated the question. "I respond with boundaries," she said. "I did not initiate the review. I did not influence its findings. I did not attempt to mitigate outcomes. I allowed the system to function without distortion." She paused. "Impartiality is not the absence of connection," she continued. "It's the refusal to let connection override process." The advisor nodded slowly. Another board member spoke. "You could have recused yourself once ownership was confirmed." "Yes," Danielle agreed. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" Danielle met his gaze evenly. "Because recusal would have implied interference," she said. "I chose transparency instead." The chair leaned back slightly. "And the personal cost," Danielle answered without hesitation. "That's not the board's concern," she said. "But for the record, it was necessary." No one pressed further. The meeting concluded with formal votes, routine matters of policy reinforcement, internal audits, and public disclosure obligations. Danielle participated fully, her voice steady, her focus precise. When it ended, there was no applause. There never was. As the room emptied, Lydia Chen approached her. "You handled that with restraint," Lydia said quietly. "Most people would have used the moment." Danielle gathered her papers. "Moments pass," she said. "Records don't." Lydia smiled faintly. "That may be the most accurate summary I've heard." Outside the building, Danielle paused on the steps. The day was bright, unremarkable. Traffic moved as it always did. People passed without recognition. This was what she had wanted, not invisibility, but normalcy. Her phone buzzed. A message from her attorney. "Family court hearing concluded. Temporary orders in place. You and the baby are protected." Danielle closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, in acknowledgement. That afternoon, Mark tried again. This time, he didn't call. He showed up. He waited outside her apartment building, pacing near the entrance, his posture no longer controlled but brittle. When Danielle approached with the stroller, he stepped forward. "Danielle," he said, "please." She stopped at a distance that felt deliberate. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I just need 5 minutes," he insisted. "You owe me that." Danielle looked at him carefully. "I don't owe you anything," she said, "but I'll listen." He swallowed. "They're treating me like a criminal." Danielle's expression did not change. "They're treating you like a subject of investigation," she said. "Those are different things." "You could talk to them," he said. "Explain." "I won't narrate your actions," she said gently. "I won't soften them, and I won't harden them." Mark's shoulders slumped. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. Danielle considered that. Intent doesn't undo impact, she said. And silence doesn't equal consent. He looked at the stroller, at the baby sleeping inside. You're taking him away from me, he said. Danielle shook her head. I'm taking us out of instability. Mark's voice broke. You don't even hate me. Danielle answered honestly. No, she said. I don't. That hurt him more than anger would have. Then why, he asked. Because accountability isn't personal, Danielle said. It's structural. He stared at her, finally understanding something too late. This was never a fight, he whispered. No, Danielle said. It was a pattern. She turned the stroller gently and walked past him, leaving him standing in the shade of a decision he could no longer influence. That evening, Danielle sat alone after putting the baby to bed. She opened her notebook one last time, not to add anything, to read. She traced the first entry with her finger, then the last. The handwriting was consistent throughout. No emotional spikes, no rushed lines. She closed the notebook and placed it in a box labeled Completed. Some records did not need to remain active. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window watching the city lights come on. She thought of the billing desk, the declined cards, the quiet humiliation Mark had believed would discipline her into compliance. He had mistaken silence for weakness. What he had never understood was that silence, when paired with memory, became evidence. Danielle had not taken revenge. She had taken responsibility. And when the truth finally required a voice, she had spoken only as much as the process demanded. Nothing more, nothing less. Legal consequences never arrived the way people expected them to. There was no sudden knock on the door, no raised voices, no public spectacle. What came instead were envelopes, plain official, impossible to argue with. Notices written in language that did not accuse, but did not ask permission either. Danielle recognized the shift immediately. This was no longer review. This was procedure. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, forwarded to her attorney but copied to her as an interested party. It confirmed what Silverline had already communicated weeks earlier, as the matter had moved fully into the jurisdiction of external authorities. The bank's role was complete. Preservation obligations remained, but influence did not. Danielle read the letter carefully, noting what it did not say as much as what it did. It did not mention her name beyond ownership confirmation. It did not reference her marriage. It did not speculate on motive. It referenced actions, transactions, records, exactly as it should. Mark received his copy the same day. Danielle knew this not because she tracked him, but because he sent her a message shorter than any before it. They're charging forward. She did not reply. The next phase unfolded methodically. Mark's attorney contacted Danielle's counsel, requesting mediation, clarification, cooperation, anything that might slow the momentum. Each request was answered the same way. All communication routed through counsel. All statements provided in writing. No narrative offered beyond documented fact. Danielle did not obstruct. She also did not assist beyond what was required. This balance confused Mark more than resistance ever could have. You're letting them destroy me, he said during their final court-ordered call. Danielle listened, her posture steady, her tone unchanged. I'm letting the process finish, she said. That's the same thing, he snapped. No, she replied. Destruction is personal. This is structural. He fell silent. Family court moved faster. The judge reviewed the evidence without drama, financial coercion, documented instability, repeated attempts to consolidate control following childbirth. The language in the ruling was careful, precise, and firm. Temporary orders became standing ones. Danielle retained primary custody. Mark's access became supervised. Financial contact restricted. When the judge finished reading, there was no commentary, no lecture, just a conclusion. Outside the courtroom, Mark looked smaller than Danielle remembered him. Not physically, something else had diminished. This didn't have to happen, he said quietly. Danielle considered that. Yes, she said, it did. He looked up, searching her face for anger, for triumph. for something he could push against. He found none of it. The criminal investigation progressed out of her view. That was intentional. Danielle did not attend briefings, did not ask for updates, did not speculate on outcomes. She had learned long ago that justice, once handed off, did not benefit from audience participation. Her focus shifted instead to restoration, not repair. Restoration meant establishing a life that did not orbit damage. She moved into a permanent apartment, modest, sunlit, chosen for its quiet rather than its prestige. She registered the baby's pediatrician, found a daycare with long wait lists and calm staff, built a routine that did not include explaining herself. At Silverline, governance continued without interruption. The interim review committee issued its report. Internal controls were strengthened, training expanded, processes clarified. Danielle reviewed the report in full. She did not insert herself into the narrative. When asked for comment, she provided exactly one sentence. Effective systems protect everyone, including those who don't think they need protection. That was quoted internally, nowhere else. Weeks passed, then months. Mark's situation resolved itself in the way such situations always did, incrementally, without ceremony. Charges were filed, negotiations occurred, consequences followed. Danielle learned of these developments only when legally necessary. She did not attend hearings. She did not sit in galleries. She did not need to witness what had already been documented. One afternoon, Rachel called. "It's done," she said simply. Danielle did not ask for details. "Thank you," she said. There was a pause on the line. "You okay?" Rachel asked again. Danielle looked around her apartment, at the baby playing on the floor, at the light shifting across the walls. "Yes," she said, "I am." That night, Danielle stood by the window once more, holding her child as the city settled into evening. The rhythm was familiar now, comforting. She thought briefly of the billing desk, the declined cards, the quiet humiliation, the assumption that cutting access would erase agency. It seemed distant now, not because it had been forgotten, but because it no longer defined the present. Mark had believed control was something you seized. Danielle knew control was something you released. Released to process, released to truth, released to time. She had not needed to fight. She had needed to endure long enough for the structure to reveal itself. The legal system had done what it was designed to do when allowed to function without interference. It had listened. It had recorded. It had concluded. And Danielle had walked away, not with satisfaction, but with something far more sustainable. Peace. Danielle did not mark the ending with a date. There was no single morning when she woke and felt that everything was over. No dramatic closing chapter. What came instead was a gradual thinning of weight, small, almost imperceptible moments when she realized she was no longer bracing for impact. The first time it happened, she was standing in line at a neighborhood pharmacy, the baby asleep against her chest. The clerk rang up the purchase and waited. Danielle handed over her card. Approved. The sound was ordinary, the moment unremarkable. And yet Danielle felt her shoulders lower a fraction of an inch, as if her body had finally accepted what her mind already knew. Access had been restored, but not the kind Mark once controlled. This access was clean, independent, untethered from permission. She did not smile. She simply thanked the clerk and walked outside into the afternoon light. Life began to organize itself around quieter anchors. Morning walks became routine. The baby learned the shape of her voice, the cadence of reassurance. Danielle learned the difference between exhaustion and depletion, and how to address each without apology. At work, her role stabilized into something sustainable. She attended board meetings with clarity, not defensiveness. Her contributions were measured. Her presence no longer required explanation. The bank moved forward. Governance improved. Training expanded. The incident became a case study, not named, not dramatized, but referenced in the way institutions reference lessons they intended not to repeat. Danielle allowed that. She did not claim credit. She did not seek absolution. She understood something now that she hadn't before. Resolution did not require recognition. One evening, months after the last legal document had been filed, Danielle found the notebook again while unpacking a box she had labeled completed. She hadn't meant to open it, but she did. She sat on the floor, the baby playing nearby, and turned the pages slowly. The handwriting was steady throughout. The tone factual. There were no outbursts, no emotional spikes. It struck her then how carefully she had protected herself, not by fighting, but by recording. She closed the notebook and placed it back in the box. Some tools were meant to be put away once their work was done. Mark remained present only in structured ways. Supervised visits, mediated communication, short exchanges focused solely on logistics. He did not apologize. Danielle did not expect him to. Accountability did not require remorse to be valid. The last time she saw him in person was outside a family services building, the baby bundled securely in her arms. Mark looked thinner, older. "I never thought you'd do this," he said quietly. Danielle met his eyes. "I didn't do anything to you," she replied. "I stopped doing things for you." He frowned as if trying to understand the distinction. "I loved you," he said. Danielle nodded. "I know. And you still," he hesitated. "You're not angry." "No," she said. "I'm finished." That seemed to hurt him more than accusation would have. She walked away without looking back. Time passed. Not dramatically, just honestly. Danielle watched her child take first steps, say first words, learn the contours of a world that felt stable, predictable, safe. She adjusted her schedule to match that world. Meetings became shorter, evenings became quieter, weekends became theirs. Sometimes late at night, she thought of the early days, the hospital corridor, the billing desk, the card reader flashing declined. She did not revisit the humiliation. She revisited the clarity. That was the moment she had stopped negotiating her own reality. And everything that followed had flowed from that decision. On the anniversary of the case's closure, Danielle received a brief internal note from Silverline. Internal review complete. All corrective actions finalized. No congratulations, no commentary. She smiled at that. It was exactly right. That evening, she cooked dinner with the windows open, the city's ambient noise drifting in. She ate slowly. She read a chapter of a book she'd been meaning to finish. Then she stood by the window one last time, not out of habit, but out of gratitude. She thought of the systems that had held, the processes that had spoken, the patience that had outlasted control. Danielle had not sought to expose. She had allowed truth to surface. And when it had, she had stepped aside. That was her strength. Quiet, durable, complete. What this story leaves us with is not a sense of triumph, but a deeper kind of clarity. Danielle's journey reminds us that power does not always announce itself with confrontation. Sometimes real strength looks like restraint. It looks like choosing accuracy over argument, process over impulse, and dignity over the need to be believed immediately. In moments when humiliation feels public and irreversible, the instinct is often to defend, to explain, to fight back. Danielle did none of those things. Instead, she trusted something quieter truth, documented over time. This story is not about revenge. It is about alignment, about what happens when someone stops absorbing the cost of another person's choices and allows systems, legal, financial, moral, to function as they were designed to. Danielle did not win by overpowering anyone. She won by refusing to distort reality to keep peace. She understood that silence paired with memory becomes evidence, and that patience paired with integrity becomes protection. There is also a lesson here about control. Control that depends on secrecy is fragile. Control that requires someone else to be smaller will eventually collapse under its own weight. Mark believed access meant ownership, that cutting someone off meant erasing their agency. Danielle showed us the opposite, That agency begins the moment we stop asking for permission to exist within our own truth. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: healing does not always look like closure with fireworks. Sometimes it looks like quiet mornings, restored routines, and a life that no longer revolves around damage. It looks like walking away without bitterness, not because the pain wasn't real, but because carrying it forward would only give it more power. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on where you might be holding yourself silent just to keep things stable. Ask yourself whose narrative you're carrying and whether it's time to put it down. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you the longest? Share your perspective in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you're drawn to stories of quiet strength, legal justice, and resilience that unfolds without spectacle, consider subscribing to the channel. More stories like this are coming, and you're always welcome to be part of the conversation.